Riddle me this, riddle me that. What's the most awful time for the big black bat? Some would say it was the Silver Age, while others would say Tom King. Both of them are interesting answers, but now it's time to talk about the early 2000s. The very first years of the new millennium were complicated for Batman, as we watched him destroy the Justice League, then Commissioner Gordon almost died and then retired, and finally Bruce Wayne became wanted for murder. These are just a few of the terrible things that happened to Batman at the start of the new millennium, when DC Comics and Batman went through a series of changes, troubles, and dramatic development, both in the stories and behind the scenes. So sit down, relax, grab a snack, and let's find out just what was the awful reality of Batman in the early 2000s. By the end of 1999, the Batman comics finished No Man's Land, the massive storyline where Gotham City was destroyed by an earthquake, and it was sealed off from the rest of the country. As the mega crossover came to an end, the reconstruction of Gotham was inevitable, and the return to the status quo was imminent. It was at the end of No Man's Land that DC Comics started preparing a complete relaunch of all the Batman comics for the year 2000. The start of the new millennium represented a new dawn for Batman, a new chapter full of opportunities and bright new ideas. It was the perfect chance to introduce a new Batman, but the only thing that was actually new was Gotham. The hometown of Batman was reimagined, and the reconstruction of the city opened the doors to radical changes. Gotham City became a futuristic metropolis of tall buildings and blinding lights, of glass towers and modern, straight architecture, with none of the Gothic elements of the past. This Gotham became unrecognizable. It looked like a wonderful place to live in. It looked nice. It looked safe. And just like the Gotham of Gotham Knights, it looked like it didn't need Batman. The old Gotham was a dark place, where massive towers of stone sprawled out of control into the heavens. The shadowy towers full of gargoyles guarding over the city were not just aesthetic, but they were also functional. The Art Deco and Gothic buildings were not just stylistic anachronisms, but these old styles of architecture provided Gotham with a distinctive look that, combined with present-day stories, became a constant reminder of the city's past, almost as if these old buildings were a ghost haunting the city, a dark memory that refuses to go away. Gotham was dark and full of terrors, a place of nightmares where the urban legend of a mysterious vigilante could actually work. The old Gotham was perfect for Batman. The new Gotham was not. But Gotham City was the least of our problems, because as 2000 rolled around, Batman decided to change the Batsuit with a yellow signal on his chest for a modern version of his original Batsuit. This change was actually necessary and awesome in many ways, but it had one big problem, and it's that there is no story behind it. The comics don't provide a reason for Batman to make this change, which is actually quite fitting, considering that the yellow oval Batsuit was also introduced without any story behind it. This lack of storytelling was understandable in 1964, but by the new millennium, this was just careless and a symptom of a bigger problem across the Batman comics. The ending of No Man's Land wasn't satisfying because Wayne Manor and the Batcave were never fully restored. Unfortunately, by the time the new stories came out, those places were already put back together. There's literally just one page that shows a big construction crew rebuilding Wayne Manor, but no explanation of how all these people didn't find the secret entrance to the Batcave, which, by the way, was also completely restored as a modern, state-of-the-art base of operations, without ever explaining how Batman brought back a place that was left in ruins. We are left to assume that Bruce and Alfred did all the heavy work by themselves, which probably would explain why the new Batcave doesn't have any of the trophies and memorabilia from the past, like the giant penny and the dinosaur. And you might think that I'm making a big deal out of it because I didn't get what I wanted. But it's not about what I want, it's about what's fair. A lot of effort went into destroying these places, so it's only fair that some effort was put into the reconstruction as well. There was a great storytelling potential to show Batman's allies helping him put everything back together. Maybe having Superman and the Flash doing it in a matter of hours, and maybe the construction crew of Wayne Manor didn't find the Batcave thanks to some helpful magic from Satana. Anything would have been better than completely ignoring it. The Batman editor Denny O'Neil wanted to keep the Batman comics as realistic as possible, so he was very adamant about keeping Batman isolated from the rest of the DC universe. But going as far as turning Gotham into a normal-ass city and removing the Batcave trophies while not explaining any of these changes is like saying these things don't matter. But they do matter, and this lack of interest in detail, storytelling and world building shows just how careless they had become. This problem, combined with the efforts of keeping Batman in its own separate corner of the DC universe, soon backfired badly. But more on that later. No Man's Land was the giant crossover that ended all giant crossovers, at least in the Batman comics, and following that the main Batman comics went their own separate ways. Now it's time to see if the new stories of each series were good, or if they were as empty and hollow as the new Batcave. The main Batman title became the superhero action-adventure series, with the stories that were written with a younger audience in mind, which was yet another big mistake. In the final chapters of No Man's Land, the Batman title was really violent and mature, and the fanbase seemed to enjoy that approach. So when Larry Hama became the main Batman writer and presented stories made for kids, it didn't work at all. The Larry Hama stories in Batman were bad. They were supposed to be made for kids, but they are beyond being just simplistic to being borderline dumb. There is no depth, no complexities, the characterization is paper thin, the dialogue and exposition are flat and excessive, and the villains are all but forgettable. In an effort to recapture the kid audiences, DC Comics tried to emulate Gotham Adventures, which was a comic book made for all ages, and it was fantastic. It was really well made, with stories and art that actually appealed to literally all ages. Unfortunately, Batman goes down the drain. Literally, in the story where Batman fights alligators controlled by a blind girl in the sewers, a girl called Allie, by the way. Allie Gator. Things were so bad that Hama's run in Batman lasted less than 6 months, introducing in his last storyline a new villain called Orca, who is a scientist that turns herself into a killer whale. Basically the same concept as Man-Bat, except this one is bad. Nevertheless, this was actually Hama's best storyline, but probably because it was co-written with artist Scott McDaniel. Meanwhile, Shadow of the Bat was cancelled at the end of No Man's Land, and in its place DC Comics created a new series called Gotham Knights, the first Batman comic book helmed by a female writer. Devin Grayson was one of the main writers during No Man's Land, and her work was so outstanding that she earned the position as the main writer in the new Batman title. Gotham Knights was the series that showcased Batman and all of his allies working together, and in the early chapters of the series, Devin Grayson presented mysteriously written entries, as if there was some unknown character, studying, analyzing each member of the Batman family, their relationships and their dynamics. It seemed as if they were building up towards something big and epic, and maybe they did, or maybe they didn't. But more on that later. Gotham Knights was a significant, no, it was a major improvement over whatever was happening in the main Batman title, but my favorite series of the new millennium has got to be Detective Comics. Greg Rucka was the main writer during No Man's Land, and he took Detective Comics in the complete opposite direction of the main Batman title. The stories in Detective Comics were 100% character-driven dramas, with serious and mature themes dominating the narrative, which was mostly centered around street-level crimes and police procedures. But the most outstanding feature of Detective Comics was, without a question, the unique and very polarizing visual style. Detective Comics was illustrated by Sean Martinborough, whose art style was bold and striking for how different it was. This expressionistic approach to art sought to enhance the mood and atmosphere of the stories by using mostly straight lines, geometric shapes, and weird perspectives, but most importantly, using an extremely limited color palette. All of the stories in Detective Comics were illustrated with only 2 colors and their different shades. It was a strange and bizarre artistic decision that put off a lot of Batman readers, but also one that captivated many others. This artistic choice was not random, as the art not only set the tone and mood of the stories, but it was actually part of the storytelling process, much like the light and shadows in black and white movies. And that's exactly the style that they were going for, a style that the creative team called crime noir, as reading these stories is almost like watching a film noir movie, to the point where I even started a playlist of film noir music to listen in the background, which actually improved the experience of reading these stories like you have no idea. These comics are already loaded with mystique and atmosphere, and the music really elevates the whole experience. I'll leave the link to the playlist in the description below in case you want to try it out for yourselves. The first story of Detective Comics focused on Commissioner Gordon and his grief after the death of his wife at the end of No Man's Land. And following that story, Greg Rucka started the first big storyline of the year. It was called Evolution, a story where the crime families have returned to Gotham after the city was reopened, but now there's a mysterious new player in town that seeks to destroy them by starting a gang war in the city. This new player is the sultry and mysterious Whisper Adair, who is in fact an agent of Ra's al Ghul, who wants to take over the criminal empires of Gotham to distribute a new drug that turns people into animal mutants? Okay, that one's weird. Whisper herself is a snake woman and the perfect femme fatale for a story about crime, detectives, passion, and chicken men? Chicken man, chicken man, chicken man, chicken man. Sure, why not? The first 4 chapters went smoothly, but then Evolution came to a sudden stop. The plot of Ra's al Ghul and his seductive minion was replaced by a filler chapter about Detective Montoya, which was then followed by a 2-part chapter about civil unrest, as the people who stayed in Gotham during No Man's Land, the OGs, became violent against the people who left and came back only when the city reopened, the DCs. The originals, OGs versus the deserters, DCs, was one of the main themes across the Batman comics after No Man's Land for about 3 seconds. Meanwhile, the interesting story of Ra's al Ghul was put on hold, without any explanation, and 3 months later Evolution came to an abrupt ending, with one final issue which was as anticlimactic as it was confusing. How could Greg Rucka and Denny O'Neil allow this to happen? What could possibly be the reason that forced them to interrupt and suddenly end a story that looked so much more promising? It made no sense until you start looking for answers outside of the Batman comics. Turns out that writer Mark Waid had decided to also use Ra's al Ghul in a big Justice League storyline called Tower of Babel. Babel? Bible? Beyblade? I'll call it Tower of B, for the load of BS it is. Tower of B was a 4-issue storyline in the GLA comic, which took place during the exact same months that the Evolution story was put on hold, so I don't think it's a stretch to assume that the higher-ups at DC Comics forced Denny O'Neil and his team to stop their Ra's al Ghul story. And for what? To make room for a story that brings back the Frank Miller Batman, but on steroids. In Tower of B, Ra's al Ghul gets closer to his dream of world domination, securing his success by taking down the Justice League using plans and ideas stolen from Batman. This story reveals that Batman has spent months, probably years of his limited time and unlimited resources, researching, analyzing, studying, and developing extremely elaborate and complex plans to take down each and every member of the Justice League. A Batman that is a psychotic paranoid who has nothing better to do than thinking up ways of neutralizing the most powerful forces of good on the planet. A Batman that is closer to being a villain than a hero. Where are the elaborate plans to neutralize the supervillains once and for all? I mean, we're talking about a guy who fights a constant, losing battle against mentally unstable criminals with no superpowers, trying to keep them locked away and failing every single time. But somehow, he's capable of taking down the entire Justice League. A Batman who is not only paranoid but also arrogant, as he doesn't even consider giving that same level of effort and thought into the protection of these plans, or even his base of operations. Tower of B is one of those stories that falls apart as soon as you start thinking critically about it. It's a textbook example of everything that's wrong with some modern versions of Batman that unfortunately a lot of people like. However, my biggest gripe against Tower of B is actually how it disrupted evolution, with the final chapter of that story evidently changing as to accommodate and fall in line with the outcome of Tower of Babel. Greg Rucka himself has admitted that he was not happy with how things turned out, because alongside this minor inconvenience, there was something major happening behind the scenes at DC Comics, and that was the retirement of the Batman editor, Denny O'Neil, which by all accounts was extremely problematic. For many years, Denny O'Neil was adamant about keeping Batman and his mythos separated from the rest of the DC universe, but by the year 2000, this approach started to become an inconvenience for DC Comics. The company wanted to use the characters of the Batman mythos, especially the villains, because of their popularity. As soon as No Man's Land ended, the Superman comics created a big story called Emperor Joker, where the Joker gets magical superpowers to fight Superman, and the consequences of the serious injury that he received at the end of No Man's Land were completely ignored, despite Denny's intention of giving Joker a permanent injury. Then the whole Tower of Babel dilemma happened, and it became clear that there was a conflict between O'Neil and DC Comics. At this point, Denny O'Neil had been the Batman editor for almost 15 years, and according to some of his collaborators, he was already on the lookout for a replacement. However, DC Comics had already set a different plan in motion. In the early months of 2000, a new editor was brought along and slowly started taking over the Batman comics. The new editor was Bob Schreck, who was apparently an accomplished editor, but how truly accomplished could a new Batman editor be if they had almost no prior experience with Batman? Schreck first took over the main Batman title, where his first action was to bring Ed Brubaker as the new Batman writer, which was an easy and obvious decision, as Brubaker was a big improvement over Larry Hama. However, this would only be the start of a major overhaul to the Batman comics. Every previous Batman editorial change was very clean and straightforward. The previous editor would step down 1 month, and the next month the new editor would take over. That didn't happen here. Bob Schreck slowly took over different Batman comics, one by one, month by month. Gotham Knight changed editors almost at the end of 2000, and before that happened, writer Devin Grayson finished the big storyline that she had been building since the beginning, and the final chapter is a story about Hugo Strange, where it is revealed that the mysterious character analyzing and studying the members of the Batman family behind the scenes was actually Batman, which is very odd and weird. It doesn't serve any significant purpose at all, and I can't help but feel as if, originally, the story was building up towards something different, bigger, but they had to change plans as the new editor was taking over. Eventually, Schreck also took over the Catwoman comic, and in a matter of months, he decided to cancel the series because it had clearly lost every sense of direction after Jim Balent left the comic. Unfortunately, instead of giving that series a proper finale, a graceful ending worthy of the first Catwoman monthly series, and a celebration of almost reaching 100 issues, the final Catwoman story of that series features Selina being hunted down by Deathstroke, who shoots at her multiple times and drops a bomb to kill her. The final image of this version of Catwoman is Selina, with her purple costume completely torn apart, agonizing and struggling to stay alive as she lays unconscious in a big pile of trash. The new management destroyed Catwoman and tossed her to the garbage. Literally. A few months later, Ed Brubaker and Darwyn Cooke successfully rebooted the character and revitalized Catwoman for a new generation. But in order to make way for this to happen, they got rid of the previous Catwoman in a very excessive manner. Personally, I think it would have been better to keep the series going and do all of these fantastic revamp in issue number 100 of the same series, but I guess issue number 100 doesn't sell as well as issue number 1. The cancellation of Catwoman was also quickly followed by the cancellation of the Batman Beyond comic, and I'm pretty sure that Gotham Adventures would have been next, but thankfully that series was one of the best-selling titles for DC, so they simply decided to give that title to another editorial department. And all of this happened as Denny O'Neil was quietly, silently replaced over the course of a year. There was no announcement, no farewell notice, no nothing. His final comic as Batman editor was the Poison Ivy story from Detective Comics number 751, where writer Greg Rucka closed the final plotline from No Man's Land. After this story, Denny O'Neil was gone, and the real problems were just starting. The Batman stories following Denny O'Neil's departure took a serious nosedive in quality, and the reason seems to be that nobody working on Batman was actually happy. Many years later, Greg Rucka reflected upon these times during an interview, and he made some pretty disturbing statements that I actually need to quote here because there's no way I can explain it better. In the interview, Greg Rucka said that Denny had gotten quite ill, and Bob Schreck was brought in as the new editor. That transition was not smooth, and that transition was not pleasant, and that transition was not courteous, and a lot of people got really wounded. A lot of people were treated very badly. There was a changing of the guard, and those of us who had been there before were either shown the door in those words or made to feel so unwelcome that we were reaching for the door as soon as we could. I am not particularly proud of the last half of my run, because the last half of that run was paid for in blood, and that's never a good feeling. All of this seems to indicate that DC Comics took advantage of Denny O'Neil's declining health to put Bob Schreck in place, and slowly, but surely, forcing O'Neil into retirement. It's no surprise that whenever a new manager, or in this case a new editor, comes along, he brings his ideas and his people to work with him, and maybe this didn't sit well with Rucka, but the fact is that former DC editors that worked with Denny, like Joe Illich, as well as longtime Batman writers like Chuck Dixon, have all mentioned what an awful experience it was to work for Schreck. In fact, in 2001, writers Devin Grayson, Greg Rucka, and Chuck Dixon, all of them started using a nickname for the new prison of Gotham, and they called it the Schreck. Normally, writers like to honor the legacy of legendary creators by naming streets, places, and landmarks of Gotham after them, like Robinson Park for Jerry Robinson, and the Goodwin Airport for Archie Goodwin. But this was the first time that a prison got named after a creator, a subtle detail that speaks volumes. There were big editorial troubles at DC, which affected the comics on every level, like the first Batman comic written by Ed Brubaker, incorrectly credited to Larry Hama on the cover. These were editorial mistakes that shows that something was not right, and the creators of the stories were the most affected by all of this. When the time came for the new big Batman crossover to start off 2001, the whole editorial debacle was on everyone's minds, and inspired by the violent takeover of the Batman editorial, Greg Rucka came up with Batman: Officer Down, the first major Batman storyline in over a year, and one that promised to be so much more than it actually delivered. Officer Down was a 7-chapter crossover published in January of 2001 across all the Batman comics. The storyline follows the Batman family and the GCPD after Commissioner Gordon is shot and seriously injured, taking all the characters on a wild chase to capture the shooter, except for Batman, who is too shocked by the situation to do anything. In the end, the shooter is found, but there is no evidence to convict him, and as Commissioner Gordon eventually comes out of the hospital, he makes the difficult decision to retire. On the surface level, a mediocre Batman storyline, where Batman is completely and totally useless, as he spends the entire story mourning and processing his grief on the bedside of Commissioner Gordon, while literally everyone else works to find the shooter. Batman's characterization becomes so frustrating that Alfred quits, creating a big deja vu to Nightfall and making it seem as if quitting is the only relevant thing that Alfred can do. Officer Down's numerous problems range from inconsistent and mediocre art in some chapters to the most boring Batman we've ever seen. It doesn't take a professional comic book editor to realize the many wrong things with this story. A good editor would have realized that having Batman mourning helplessly for the whole story is a big problem, one that had a simple solution: replace Batman with Oracle. The emotional distress of Barbara Gordon at the idea of losing her father, the only family that she has left, would keep Oracle out of action, forcing the Batman family to find the shooter without Oracle's assistance, information, and resources. This was the perfect story for Batman to show why he is the world's greatest detective, by finding the shooter using nothing but his brains and skills. Officer Dawn also gave Batman the chance to grow and overcome his fear of losing people close to him, but instead they turned Batman into a helpless and frightened kid. The popular opinion holds that this story is really bad, but considering all that went down at DC Comics, I would say that Officer Dawn is actually a masterpiece. Not because of its decidedly terrible execution, but because of the origins of the story, the inspiration behind it, and the metaphorical reflection of what the creators of the story were going through. Because, you see, Officer Dawn was partially inspired by the iconic episode of Batman the Animated Series, I Am the Night, where Commissioner Gordon is also shot and Batman has to deal with his grief in order to stop the killer. The difference is that I Am the Night was a character study of Batman and what drives the character to keep fighting, while Officer Dawn was actually a very ingenious homage and a heartfelt send-off to the legendary Batman editor Denny O'Neil, disguised as a story about Commissioner Gordon's retirement. The story where Commissioner Gordon retires, coming out around the same time as Denny O'Neil's retirement, is not a coincidence, as the Batman writers associated Denny with Gordon in more ways than one. Commissioner Gordon became a really important character thanks to Batman Year 1 in 1986, the same year that Denny O'Neil became the Batman editor. Commissioner Gordon and Denny O'Neil arrived in Gotham at the same time, and together, they stayed in Gotham for better or worse. Even after the Joker crippled his daughter and tried to drive him insane, Gordon remained in Gotham. When Bruce Wayne was broken and he left the city at the mercy of a crazy replacement, Gordon remained in Gotham. When Batman traveled around the world to stop a deadly virus that killed thousands of people, Gordon remained in Gotham. When an earthquake destroyed the city and the place became a wasteland of chaos without Batman for 3 months, Gordon remained in Gotham. Gordon was more consistent in protecting Gotham than Batman during all these moments, and just like Gordon, Denny O'Neil remained in Gotham. But now DC Comics had pulled the trigger behind Denny's back, like the crooked cop that pulled the trigger behind Gordon's back, and at the end of it all, both Commissioner James Gordon and editor Denny O'Neil retired, and they were no longer in Gotham. I believe that Officer Dawn was absolutely inspired by what happened behind the scenes at DC Comics, as there are just too many parallel situations. While Gordon is at the hospital, a complete unknown is appointed as the new commissioner, in the same way that while Denny was ill, a new editor was appointed. The reaction of the GCPD at the news is not one of joy, but discomfort, mirroring the reaction of the Batman creative teams. Alfred quitting is probably what the people at DC Comics wanted to do at the time, what some of them did. But perhaps the most emotional moment of the story happens just before Gordon was shot, when the GCPD members throw a party to celebrate Gordon's birthday. Before the night is over, Commissioner Gordon gives each one of his people a key, a symbolic representation of the power they have, and as he gets ready to leave the building, Gordon looks at them one last time, and he leaves them with 4 final words. With Commissioner Gordon being a symbolic metaphor of Denny O'Neil, it's not hard to imagine that the writers and artists created this moment with Denny in mind, as he gave them all the keys to the Batman mythos before leaving. The man who shot Gordon was not arrested, he was not convicted for a lack of evidence, and thus the message of the story seems to be that sometimes there are no happy endings. Sometimes the bad guys get away. Sometimes the Shreks of the world win. The retirement of Denny O'Neil was really hard on the creative people of Batman, especially on Greg Rucka, who followed up Officer Dawn with one final story, where Gotham City celebrates the life and career of Commissioner Gordon. But the ceremony is interrupted by Two-Face, who flips a coin to decide how to proceed, and then he gives a magnificent speech about Gordon, about their alliance, about a partnership that ended before its time. Clearly another parallel metaphor for the partnership between O'Neil and Rucka himself. This story was one last tip of the hat, or flip of the coin, for the best editor the Batman comics had ever seen. And if you think I'm reading too much into these silly comic book adventures, well, tell that to the 2 henchmen of Two-Face in this story, whose names are Dennis and Neil. Denny O'Neil might not have gotten a proper send-off by DC Comics, but he got something even better: the respect and recognition from his peers inside a Batman story. At first glance, Officer Down might be one of the weakest Batman stories ever created, but once we understand the inspiration behind it, it's hard to ignore the value of the story. Though in Officer Down Batman earned the title of the world's greatest wimp, it kind of makes sense, because the writers probably wanted to show that without Gordon, Batman is not the same. Just like without Denny, Batman doesn't work that well. After Officer Down, there was a new status quo in the Batman comics that nobody was familiar with. Gordon and Alfred were gone. Nightwing was a cop in Bloodhaven, while Robin was away in a private school, and Oracle had her hands full with the Birds of Prey. If the Batcave was already empty at the start of the new Gotham, now it was really empty. The Batman writers had a really hard time in this new status quo. Their morale declining after the editorial transition, and the lack of direction from a good editor resulted in weird storytelling choices. First, Batman starts training the Spoiler for no apparent reason, and in the process he tells her the truth about Robin without consulting with Tim first. A very cheap and lazy way to create conflict between Batman and Robin at the expense of characterization. Similarly, Nightwing has a really weird encounter with Catwoman, where she kisses him and they make out very intensely in yet another example of weird characterization for shock value. Another story also reveals that Matches Malone, the identity that Batman uses to go undercover, was actually a real person, and that Batman stole this identity because he thought the real Malone was dead. But then when the real Malone actually dies, Batman becomes Matches Malone in his mind, and it's a convoluted mess. Batman thinks that stealing Malone's name was actually fine, because he was using it for good, while completely ignoring the fact that he was directly responsible for the death of a man. No amount of rationalization can save these stories, and it's no wonder that all of this nonsense started happening as soon as Denny O'Neil retired. Matches Malone was created by O'Neil in the 1970s, and I really doubt that he would have been okay with this weird and pointless story. Things were very different now, and for the first time ever, the Batman comics started doing crossovers with the Superman comics, in a story where Bruce Wayne becomes the owner of the Daily Planet, while Batman and Superman steal the Kryptonite ring from President Lex Luthor. Though it was nice to see Batman and Superman collaborating in their main comics, this crossover interrupted the stories happening in Detective Comics, and changed the mood of that series completely. 2001 was an odyssey for Batman. In Gotham Knights, writer Devin Grayson and artist Roger Robinson delivered really good character-driven stories that explored the relationships between the Batman family. There were some really good stories, like the one where Azrael and Nightwing work together and finally get to talk about what it meant for each of them to step into the role of Batman. A fantastic story all around, and there are many of those in Gotham Knights, including the story where Bruce finally adopts Dick Grayson. But then there are also bad stories, like the one where Bruce Wayne buys a gun to overcome his fear of guns, which honestly doesn't make sense. Gotham Knights becomes a hit-or-miss series, where the good stories are really good, and the bad ones are just lame. The main Batman title, however, was 100% lame. Ed Brubaker was a decent Batman writer, but he was more interested in the dialogue than the character. His Batman is constantly ineffective, always going through some kind of existential crisis that prevents him from being good at his job. A Batman that is almost always depressed and self-absorbed in past memories, which is another big problem with Brubaker's run, as for the most part he uses flashbacks as the primary storytelling device in almost every one of his stories. There are flashbacks to Bruce's never-before-seen childhood moment, flashbacks to year one, and even flashbacks to Bruce Wayne's last week. Flashbacks that are meant to contextualize the characters, situations, and conflicts, but ultimately end up hindering the pacing of the stories. However, flashbacks were not the only constant feature from the very start of Brubaker's run, as he was also adamant about using this new character called Zeiss, the new Batman villain that he created and who appeared in almost all of his stories. Unfortunately, Zeiss is as interesting as a pair of goggles. He is able to see things in slow motion, and he can learn the moves of his opponents just by looking at them once, so naturally he fights Batman, and loses as soon as Batman breaks his goggles. And that is basically the whole dynamic of Brubaker's Batman run in 2001, constantly presenting Zeiss as the most interesting new Batman villain, but never actually living up to that expectation. Between sighs, the flashbacks, and a weak attempt at creating a new romantic interest for Bruce, the best quality of the main Batman title was the art of Scott McDaniel, the Nightwing artist of the 90s whose work in Batman is, at best, earnest. Though Scott McDaniel may not be on anyone's list of top 10 Batman artists, at least he was given the chance to illustrate most of the stories of his run, which is something that did not happen in Detective Comics. After Officer Down, Detective Comics became a weird series, where Greg Rucka consistently delivered the most interesting stories out of all the Batman comics, and although all the covers were greatly illustrated by Dave Johnson, the interior art was always done by different artists. Despite this lack of visual consistency, Greg Rucka created great stories, including what is possibly the best Mad Hatter storyline of all time, where the Hatter mind controls the entire GCPD, creating utter chaos across Gotham. Rucka also wrote the story where Harvey Bullock quits the GCPD, making drastic changes to the supporting characters of the police department, introducing new characters like Detective Crispus Allen as the new partner of Renee Montoya, and Lieutenant Maggie Zoyer as the new head of the Major Crimes Unit. Rucka was really interested in the GCPD members and the dynamics of police procedures, but perhaps the most interesting new character of his run was Sasha Bordeaux, a character that was introduced as the personal bodyguard of Bruce Wayne. Sasha was hired by Lucius Fox to protect Bruce, and the idea of Sasha doing her best to protect the one man in Gotham that absolutely doesn't need protection is quite funny. But the concept couldn't really be sustained for more than a couple of stories, which is why Sasha's relationship with Bruce quickly started to change. The original idea with Sasha was to create romantic tension for Bruce, but after the events of Officer Down, Sasha became more than just his bodyguard and possible romantic interest, as she quickly discovered the secret of Batman. At this point, Bruce was living with Sasha in Wayne Manor, and he decided to train her to make her part of his mission. Sasha trained really hard for months, and in that time she started developing feelings for Bruce, which created a big problem because one of Bruce's old girlfriends had just returned, creating a weird love triangle between Bruce, Sasha, and none other than Vicky Vale. No, Vesper Fairchild. But in all honesty, it should have been Vicky Vale. Vesper Fairchild, a radio host personality created in the 90s by writer Doug Moench and artist Kelly Jones, is one of the most unique but often forgotten romantic interests for Bruce. Vesper disappeared entirely after Doug Moench left the Batman comics at the start of No Man's Land, and their short-lived romance was all but forgotten. In 2001, Greg Rucka decided to bring her back, but there was just one problem. This was not the same Vesper. The Vesper of the 90s was the Siren of the Night, an intelligent woman with a unique personality and strong opinions, who was very well known as a radio host celebrity across Gotham, and who was serious about her career and her relationships. The new Vesper, however, was a shallow imitation. Apparently, during No Man's Land, she decided to go into journalism, and the reason she came back to Gotham was to find evidence, photographic evidence, that Bruce Wayne is Batman. In other words, Vesper Fairchild had become Vicky Vale. I don't understand why they had to drag Vesper back to Gotham and turn her into another photojournalist that is romantically interested in Bruce and who wants to prove that he is Batman. It didn't make sense to me. But then I realized that maybe the problem was that DC Comics didn't want to see the real Vicky Vale die. In the final months of 2001, the Batman status quo had become very weird. The new management at the GCPD didn't want Batman's help. Lucius Fox suffers a stroke that forces him out of Wayne Enterprises, and Batman's relationship with the Batman family was all but fractured. Batman had alienated all of his friends and allies, keeping them at arm's length and working all by himself, or at the very least only with Sasha, who became his new Alfred and Robin all in one. A bodyguard, a domestic assistant, and a sidekick with a random costume put together in a hurry, and without a code name or an alias. The relationship of Bruce and Sasha had become that of an old married couple, always arguing or barely talking except during the missions, where Batman constantly told her exactly what to do do and how to do it. Batman's personality as a control freak was out of control, and as if Batman was not already miserable enough, he then decided to take away what little love and happiness he had left by pushing Vesper out of his life, not only breaking up with her but doing it in the most playboy way possible. And it's at this moment that we realize why Greg Rucka was not proud of this part of his run, because Detective Comics had become romance comics. Something wasn't right, something had to be done, and something was done. Batman had become too heartless, too cold and emotionally distant. It was time to teach him a lesson. It was time to break him. Again. After breaking up with Vesper, the next time Bruce Wayne gets to see her, he tries to fix his mistake. He tries to show her that he cares, show her some love and appreciation. It's just too bad that corpses can't feel anything. Vesper Fairchild is dead. Bruce Wayne finds the body and he is helpless, in shock. The woman he once loved, the woman whose heart he broke, now lay dead in Wayne Manor. Sasha is also there, watching the scene in disbelief. They had just come from the streets of Gotham, doing the vigilante stuff, and now their world was upside down. The GCPD arrives at the crime scene at the perfect time, something that rarely happens in Gotham. That should have been the first sign that something was wrong. The police find Bruce Wayne desperately clutching to the stiffening body of Vesper, and naturally, as every stereotypical cops do, they immediately assume that Bruce is the killer. He was found at the crime scene when they arrived, so obviously that's the only possible explanation. The GCPD quickly arrests Bruce Wayne and his bodyguard, feeling good about themselves because for the first time in a long time, they seem like they are competent at their jobs, as they actually captured a killer without Batman's help. This is the start of Bruce Wayne Murderer, the first big storyline of 2002. With Batman out of action, it is up to the rest of the Batman family to find the truth. But things are not so simple. Most of them don't know what to believe. They all think that there's a chance that Bruce did kill Vesper. All of them except Alfred and Nightwing, both of whom came back to Gotham after learning the terrible news. This is just horrible. The Batman family is not convinced of Bruce's innocence, and though they do investigate, the evidence they find still points to Bruce. They find the gun that he bought, which gives them means. They find out that Vesper was trying to uncover his secret, which gives them motive. They think that Batman might have just flipped because of how distant and cold he was acting lately. With more questions than answers, they seek guidance from Bruce, but he gives them nothing except the silent treatment from behind bars. The case is now fully in the hands of the police, but they have already stopped looking, and everyone has seemingly accepted this awful truth. Everyone except us. We know he didn't do it, we just want for someone in the story to actually start looking for the real killer. But that doesn't happen, making everyone look incompetent at best and at worst, indifferent and disloyal. What follows is an arduous police procedure where both Bruce and Sasha are heavily interrogated about the night of the murder, but because of their shared secret, they refuse to say anything. With no alibi and no possible explanation for the dead body, they are both taken to the Shrek and soon after to Blackgate, where things only get worse. Bruce Wayne Murderer is an incredibly depressing storyline, where Bruce spends all the time in prison, and despite the fact that his friends, family and allies visit him trying to help him to come up with ideas of how to sort things out, Bruce refuses them every time, as he grows more sullen and detached. The storyline doesn't feature Batman at all, with Bruce being a helpless prisoner all the time, until he reaches his breaking point and decides to turn his back completely on his Bruce Wayne identity. The main Batman comics are really depressing here, and the only good and light-hearted moments happen in the other comics, like Nightwing, Robin and Birds of Prey, all of them written by Chuck Dixon, who apparently was the only writer who was not depressed while doing this story. Of course, you can't really have a Batman story with Batman locked away all the time, so a couple of months into the story, Batman escapes from prison, and although we never actually get to see how he does it, this changes the whole dynamic of the story. No longer is it about helpless Bruce Wayne allowing the system to run its course. Now Batman is in control, and this should be good news. Batman is now free to investigate, free to clear his name and find the killer, free to find justice for him, for Sasha, for Vesper. But no. I thought we could get decent Batman stories in an indecent time, but I was wrong. Because instead of doing the logical, the interesting, and probably the obvious thing, Batman takes an unexpected turn, and the story falls into a downward spiral, where Batman not only decides not to investigate the case, but he also gives up completely on Bruce Wayne. He abandons Wayne Manor, the Batcave, the Batman family, leaving everything and everyone behind without a second thought or a good explanation. This is the start of Bruce Wayne Fugitive, a story where the good guys fight the good guys. Batman and Nightwing have this big brawl in the Batcave as Nightwing lashes out in rightful frustration against Bruce. But there is no Bruce here. Not anymore. Only Batman, a character capable and willing to punch his kids. Because he can. If Bruce Wayne Murderer is depressing, then Bruce Wayne Fugitive is infuriating. Not only is this Batman utterly broken, but the storyline doesn't get properly developed for the next 3 or 4 months across the Batman comics, as they instead choose to keep telling other stories in this new weird status quo, where Batman is Batman all the time and he works from a small underground bunker in the middle of Gotham. In that sense, Fugitive is more like a subplot rather than the main storyline, adding another layer of frustration to an already exasperating story. This Batman is a violent prick who denies everything about Bruce Wayne, which makes you realize that Batman has just become Azrael. Jean-Paul Valley was the example of a terrible, violent Batman, denying his identity and becoming Batman 24/7, which is why the best moment of Fugitive happens when Azrael goes back to the Batcave and reclaims his old Batsuit, leading to a confrontation where Azrael calls Batman out for being a hypocrite. This is the best, the most cathartic moment of the entire storyline, and it's no surprise that it was written between Devin Grayson and Denny O'Neil, who was still writing the Azrael comics. But that was only one chapter of many more that needed to go by before Fugitive made any sort of real progress. The entire Batman family broke their backs in their respective comics trying to find the truth, while Batman did fuck all to help them. Batman only understands reason and sees the white light for the first time in this story when a random, old and retired cop reminds him about the murder of the Waynes and brings Bruce Wayne back, showing that the best way to fix Batman is just giving him a dose of flashbacks of Crime Alley, the shadow of the Dark Knight Returns looming ominously over this storytelling decision. Bruce Wayne Fugitive eventually comes to an end in issue number 605 of Batman, with a massive exposition dump of dialogue, where Batman explains why he acted the way he did, and how he plans to make things right. He explains he just forgot all about his humanity, and the reason why he became Batman in the first place, an explanation that relies on the idea that Batman became more intense, more driven, more devoted to his mission, without remembering his primary motivation and reason to do it. Misdirection and mischaracterization, powerful agents for the uninitiated, but in this channel we are all initiated, aren't we? The idea of Bruce Wayne being framed for the murder of a woman with whom he was romantically involved might have sounded like a fresh new idea in 2002, but the story is just a rehash, a repeat of the exact situation that already played out years before in the 90s. In Shadow of the Bat number 55, writer Alan Grant presented the exact same scenario of Bruce Wayne being caught by the GCPD at the scene of the crime, holding the dead body of a woman with whom he was romantically associated, and then Bruce being arrested and interrogated. It's the same plot down to the same story beats, but there's one fundamental difference, and it's that from the get-go, Bruce Wayne and Batman are one and the same, and he knows how to get out of the situation. Bruce fully cooperates with the police, going as far as giving them subtle hints and clues about things they overlooked at the crime scene, like only the world's greatest detective can do. But that's not all. Batman is still needed out there, but Bruce is locked away. In these times of need, Bruce is not alone. He's got allies, and none better than Nightwing, who once again becomes Batman temporarily in order to fulfill the missions that Bruce had been forced to miss during his time in prison. A time that wasn't very long, as Bruce makes sure he is very quickly acquitted, and the frame-up of Bruce Wayne is over and done in just one issue. There's a reason the Batman stories of the 90s command respect, because the people in charge of Batman in the 90s knew the difference between a great storyline and a cheap gimmick that didn't need more than one issue. And even then they managed to turn cheap gimmicks into interesting and exciting stories, understanding just why the character works and why people read these stories in the first place. When the time came to finally end Fugitive after almost a year's worth of stories, it is all very quickly wrapped up in the final issue, showing that Batman, when he is actually working, can get things done in no time, as it should have happened, as it already happened. In the end, Batman gathers all the evidence and the real killer is found, the assassin David Kane, and with him comes the person who hired him to frame Bruce Wayne. The big bad villain of the whole saga presents itself as a déjà vu to the ending of No Man's Land. Lex Luthor, once again the main villain of a big Batman story, and once again working behind the scenes, seeking nothing but personal revenge, while Kane had his own reasons to frame both Bruce Wayne and Batman, reasons that, just like him, are related to Batgirl, just to make sure that nobody forgets that she is also part of the story. The whole point of Murderer and Fugitive was to challenge this idea that Bruce Wayne is just a mask and that Batman is the real character, but we already knew that he is both Bruce Wayne and Batman, not because he has to be, but because he chooses to be. The real problem is the execution of a storyline where Batman was unable, or worse, unwilling to do anything to resolve the main conflict, leaving us with a story where Batman is a massive prick that fixes everything in the end with a simple
"Oh, I'm sorry. Am I in trouble? What?"
The ending of Fugitive was just as disappointing as the story itself, because in the end David Kane surrenders himself to the authorities and confesses to killing Vesper, providing all the information required and absolving Bruce Wayne from all charges, making it all way too easy for Batman, who did the bare minimum to get this victory, which is exactly why this doesn't feel earned or satisfying. Of course, Lex Luthor tries to silence Kane before he stands trial, and Deadshot is the one hired to kill Kane. Batman finds himself between two deadly assassins, and these are some of the best written Batman stories by Ed Brubaker, thanks to the use of established enemies, more action than dialogue, and luckily, no flashbacks. But then again, it was probably thanks to the contributions of Geoff Johns as co-writer, which was too little too late to make a difference, as Ed Brubaker closed his run in Batman with these stories. And I really feel sorry for artist Scott McDaniel, who also ends his run in Batman without ever illustrating a truly great story. After Fugitive, writer Greg Rucka was also ending his run in Detective Comics, but not without giving closure and a proper ending to the story of Sasha, the character that he created with an original idea in mind, but who was taken in strange directions during this unusual run. Over the course of the Murderer and Fugitive sagas, Sasha found herself suffering and deprived of freedom because of her loyalty to Bruce Wayne, a loyalty that eventually gets her killed in prison, which just goes to show how awful Batman acted in the whole story, with him breaking out of prison and leaving Sasha to rot inside and die, instead of working to clear their names and save her. But Sasha was not dead. It was all a conspiracy by Checkmate, a super-secret organization that recruited Sasha and gave her a new name, a new face, a new life after death. The inevitable reunion between Bruce and Sasha happens in the final Detective Comics chapter written by Greg Rucka, where, after months of chasing Checkmate, Batman manages to get a meeting with Sasha, and they reveal their feelings for each other, knowing perfectly well that they can't be together. The vast majority of the Batman fandom doesn't care about Sasha or this impossible romance, but I find it interesting because this is a story of frustrated lovers whose relationship was never meant to be because of powerful forces outside of their control is more like a reflection of Greg Rucka's run in Detective Comics, the story of a writer who started out with ambitious plans and great ideas that were just never meant to be because of powerful forces outside of his control. Some of the stories we've talked about in this video might be someone's favorite Batman stories, or even someone's introduction to the Batman comics, and thus, they are special stories for some people. But there's a reason why there are not many adaptations, movies, or even YouTube videos about these stories, because at the end of the day, they are forgettable stories that only make sense if you force them to. For those of you who really like these stories, well, you're not wrong. They are actually great when we compare them to the actual, most awful Batman story of the early 2000s, when Frank Miller struck again. And it seems like the time has finally come to talk about that. But maybe in the next video. The awful reality of Batman in the early 2000s is for the most part true, but sometimes the truth isn't good enough. Sometimes people deserve more. And in all honesty, the early 2000s were not entirely awful. After all, it was during this time that we got truly outstanding works, like the best psychological exploration of Batman by Darwyn Cooke in Batman Ego, or the first representations of the black community in Gotham, with the stories like The Hill and the new vigilante called Orpheus, and also some of the best noir Batman stories in Gotham Noir and Nine Lives, which are also great stories to read with the noir background music from the playlist that I created. I just really like to share good music and also good stories, so if you want to know more about the good Batman comics from the early 2000s, then check out my Patreon, where I create posts about what I think are the best Batman stories of every year. And on that note, a massive thanks to my Patreons for the support, and a special thanks to Thomas, Rod, Daniel, John, and Eddie. Thank you all so much for watching this video, and as always, I will see you in the next one. Oh, okay.